The phone started ringing just as the sun was going down behind the row of battered maples along Main Street. I was alone at the kitchen table, the kind of Midwest evening that presses silence into every corner of the house. My fork hovered above a slab of leftover roast, gravy congealing into puddles on the plate. The TV flickered with the local news, something about another manufacturing plant closing in Youngstown, and for a moment I stared through the screen as if I might see my younger self working late shifts, just another face in a crowd of men who'd given their backs to industry and gotten nothing but scars for their trouble. But it was the phone, insistent and sharp, that cut through the memory. Not the old rotary on the wall, but the cordless, sleek plastic, so ordinary I almost didn't answer. Some part of me hesitated, the way you do when you know a storm is coming, but habit overruled instinct. I reached for it with a hand that still bore oil stains from decades of honest labor. The caller ID showed a New York area code. That was enough to make my stomach tighten, and something in me, call it hope, call it stupidity, began to twist. I pressed talk. The voice on the other end was a whisper of velvet and glass, and all at once I felt the years peel back. "Hi, Dad. It's me, Emily." My hand went slack and the fork clattered to the plate. 20 years, gone like that, swept away by 4 syllables that once meant everything. Couldn't breathe. The girl who'd stormed out of my life the week after her mother's funeral. Never called, never wrote. Not a single Christmas card or birthday wish. Now her voice slid through the line as if time was nothing but a story you told yourself. I couldn't find my own words at first. I just sat there, the thumping of my heart so loud I barely heard the rest. She said she'd seen the news. "Congratulations, Dad. I heard you won the lottery, $10 million. There was a softness in her tone, or the memory of it, carefully arranged over something cold and calculating. I gripped the phone as if it might shatter in my palm. The weight of everything I'd lost, her childhood, the sound of her laugh in the backyard, her mother's last breath in our old bedroom, settled over me like the blanket you pull up in winter, more out of habit than comfort. I said her name, barely a whisper. It hung between us, delicate and dangerous. She paused, just a breath, and then came the apology, sweet as honey and twice as sticky. "I'm sorry it's been so long. I was scared. I missed you. I want to make things right." The words should have meant something, should have sparked hope. Instead, they curled in my gut like a question I was afraid to ask. It was all so perfectly timed. The TV, muted now, flashed my face from the night before. Walter Mitchell, small-town mechanic, sudden millionaire. My secret out for the world, and suddenly my daughter, too. Emily invited me to her 40th birthday party in New York. She said it like a promise, a chance to undo 2 decades of silence. I tried to imagine her at 40. Couldn't. In my mind, she was always 16, slamming doors, her mother's eyes ablaze with something I could never name. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I said yes. I didn't know why. Maybe hope dies harder than we want to believe. After she hung up, I sat motionless in the growing dark, the phone still pressed to my ear. The house felt smaller, older. Every photo on the wall, a young family at Cedar Point, Emily on her first bicycle, Linda laughing under the fall leaves, seemed to shift beneath the weight of memory. I looked at the scrawled New York address on my notepad, the letters crooked from a hand that hadn't written her name in years. Outside, the neighbors' porch lights came on one by one, but inside everything stayed gray. The phone's silence was louder than any argument we'd ever had. I wanted to smash it, throw it through the window, but instead I set it down gently, like you do with something fragile you can't bear to break. I remembered the first time I lost her, long before she left for good. Her mother's illness had eaten away at the family inch by inch, until all that was left was silence, unspoken resentment, and the staggering bills that piled up on the kitchen counter. When Linda died, Emily came back from college in a suit that cost more than my best month's paycheck. She asked about the money, the insurance. I told her the truth. There was nothing left. Her anger was swift, surgical, cutting me deeper than any argument before or since. That night, she packed her bags and walked out without looking back. It was the last time I saw her. I kept waiting for a sign, a postcard, a voicemail, anything to say she'd forgiven me. Instead, the years just piled up, one silent holiday after another. Now all of it was rushing back in the span of a single phone call. Her voice, sweet but rehearsed, talking about reconciling, about starting over. But I could feel the gap between her words. The money, the lottery, the headline that made a stranger into a prospect. The clock on the stove read 8:24 p.m. Time meant nothing. I got up and wandered to the living room, turning on the old lamp by the recliner where Linda used to read. I sifted through a shoebox of photographs, searching for the face I used to know. Emily in her prom dress, Emily with her first car, the same blue Chevy I rebuilt for her 16th birthday. I traced her smile with a thumb that shook, not from age, but from something closer to fear. I wanted to believe in second chances, but the memory of her voice, the way she said Dad, echoed with longing and accusation. The pain was as sharp as it had been the day she left, but now it was tangled up with suspicion. Had she changed? Had I? I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door to her old room. I hadn't opened it in years. Dust on the doorknob, her posters still peeling on the walls inside, trophies from swim meets and spelling bees gathering cobwebs on the shelves. I cracked the door and breathed in the scent of a childhood lost to time. What would I say to her? What could I possibly give her, besides the money she seemed to want so badly? Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay awake listening to the creaks and sighs of the house, haunted by the ghosts of words left unsaid. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily as a little girl, arms wrapped around my neck, whispering secrets only a father could hold. I wondered if that girl still existed, somewhere beneath the layers of disappointment and ambition. By dawn, I was still staring at the ceiling. The sunlight came through the curtains, cold and pale. I made coffee out of habit and watched the steam curl up like old regrets. I tried to convince myself that the invitation meant something, that maybe blood really was thicker than water. But the more I thought about her words, the more they sounded like lines from a script. I went out to the porch, the boards creaking under my weight, and watched the world wake up. Neighbors waved. Someone jogged by with a golden retriever. It was all so ordinary, so achingly normal, but inside I was unraveling. $10 million. It was supposed to fix everything, but all it had done was call the past back from the grave. I decided I would go to New York. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Maybe I'd find my daughter, or maybe I'd find nothing but more disappointment. Either way, something in me needed an answer. As I packed a small bag that afternoon, my hands trembled. Not from excitement, but from a kind of dread I couldn't name. I pulled out my old watch, the one Linda had given me on our 20th anniversary. The band was worn thin, the face scratched and faded, but it still kept time. I slipped it onto my wrist, a reminder that some things endure, even when everything else falls apart. Just before leaving for the bus station, I looked around the house one last time. The quiet was heavy, but not empty. I could almost hear Linda's voice, gentle but firm. Don't let hope blind you, Walt. People show you who they are. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped into the uncertain dusk, every nerve alive with the knowledge that this trip could change everything, or nothing at all. I took the first step toward her world, the world that had shut me out so long ago. My heart hammered with questions I couldn't shake. What would I find waiting for me in New York? A daughter? A stranger? Or just another version of the man I'd become? Someone marked by what he'd lost and what he still dared to hope for. There are moments in life that feel like they carve out a piece of your soul and hide it away, leaving you to wonder what you used to look like before the loss. As I stood in the dim glow of my kitchen the morning after Emily's call, I felt older than my 67 years. The chair at the table still bore the imprint of last night's uneaten dinner. The notepad where I'd scrawled her new address in New York lay beside an untouched mug of coffee, its surface already cold and slick. I didn't have to ask myself why I hadn't slept. The answer hummed quietly in my bones, as familiar as the squeak of the screen door on summer nights when Emily was small. I drifted into the living room, drawn by a restless urge to see proof of the life that had come before this. The shelves were lined with reminders, though I'd learned to avoid them most days. Old photo albums with plastic sleeves curling at the corners, a snow globe from Cleveland that Emily had loved as a child, trophies from swim meets and county fairs gathering dust. I took down an album at random and opened it to a page from when she was maybe 9. Her arms looped around our old beagle, Buddy, her front teeth missing, a smile wide enough to split the day in two. Next to her, Linda, my wife, looked at me from the past with that quick, easy joy I hadn't seen in years. A photograph is only a memory when you want it to be. Other times, it's a wound that never really closes. I flipped the pages in slow motion, each turn calling up the sound of Emily's voice, the scent of pancakes on Saturday mornings, Linda's laughter drifting through the house as she folded laundry by the window. If I listened closely enough, I could almost hear the echo of the arguments too, the sharp words that burrowed beneath the surface and stayed there. I remembered the last spring before Linda got sick. Money was tight, always had been, but Linda made the best of it, patching the kitchen wallpaper with scraps of newspaper, humming as she worked. Emily would do her homework at the table, glancing up every so often to ask questions I sometimes couldn't answer. Those evenings seemed endless and safe, the world held at bay just outside our door. But time is cruel in its consistency. Linda's illness swept over our home like a winter storm, flattening all plans, erasing boundaries we'd thought were solid. I watched her shrink into the hospital sheets, stubborn and silent, refusing to let Emily see her cry. I worked extra hours at the garage, pretending the money would somehow be enough to save her, pretending I could fix the things I could barely understand. When Linda died, something in Emily died too. She came home for the funeral in a sharp gray suit and heels that made her look older than her 20 years. We spoke little. I tried to find the right words, but everything sounded clumsy in my mouth, too small for the pain between us. On the morning after the service, she stood in the kitchen with a face set like stone and asked if there was any money left. Insurance, inheritance, anything her mother had planned for her. I told her the truth. The cancer treatments had drained everything we had and more. Her disappointment was cold, clinical. Not a raised voice but a tightening of the jaw, a silence that said more than any argument could. She left the next day, suitcase in hand, and with her went every illusion I'd ever had about second chances. Now, 2 decades later, the phone call had cracked open that old wound, let all the old ghosts out into the morning air. I found myself lingering at the threshold of her bedroom, still mostly untouched except for the fine layer of dust that covered her childhood. Her varsity jacket still hung on the back of her chair. The bedspread, yellow with sunflowers, faded but cheerful, looked like it was waiting for her to come home and dump her backpack onto it. I closed the door softly, then sat in the living room, the photo album spread across my lap. If I let myself, I could get lost in the nostalgia. But the truth was more complicated. It wasn't just grief or regret keeping me awake. It was something sharper, a sense of unfinished business. I wondered if Emily remembered the good years, or if her memory was all debts and disappointments. Did she still see me as the man who'd let her down, or as the father who'd carried her on his shoulders at the state fair, who'd fixed her bicycle 100 times, who'd tried and failed to keep the world from swallowing her whole? For a long time, I sat in the quiet, thinking about how easily life can pivot on a single moment. I had always assumed that someday Emily would call, maybe on my birthday or Christmas, and say she was sorry for leaving. I thought the years would soften whatever anger she carried. But now that she had reached out, her voice smooth, careful, practiced, I wondered if I was only hearing what I wanted to hear. The day passed in a haze of old routines. I drove to the post office to check my mail, nodding to Mrs. Talbot behind the counter, who'd once known Emily as a teenager. The mail was the same as always. Bills, grocery flyers, a card from a friend at the auto shop who'd heard about the lottery win and scrawled a quick, "Don't let it change you, Walt." Too late for that, I thought. In the afternoon, I went online at the library, something I rarely did. I searched for Emily, surprised by how easily her name surfaced in business articles and press releases. She'd done well for herself, at least on the surface, a partner at a boutique consulting firm in Manhattan, a handful of media mentions about young female entrepreneurs breaking barriers. But when I dug deeper, I found hints of trouble. Lawsuits, disgruntled partners, whispers of financial mismanagement. It wasn't clear what had gone wrong, but the pattern was familiar. Bright beginnings, rough endings, a string of bridges burned along the way. I leaned back in the creaky library chair, watching the cursor blink on the search page. The girl in the yellow bedspread had built herself a fortress out of ambition and success, but the foundation was starting to crack. I printed out a few articles and stuffed them into my jacket pocket. The librarian, Mrs. Green, raised an eyebrow at the stack but said nothing. I nodded, thanked her, and walked home through the chill that never seemed to leave this part of Ohio in March. That night, the house was quieter than usual. Every floorboard, every gust of wind against the window, seemed magnified in the emptiness. I sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out before me, rereading each line until the words blurred. I didn't want to believe Emily was in trouble. I didn't want to believe she saw me as nothing more than a safety net. But the evidence was there, as plain as day, stitched between the lines of press releases and legal notices. I made a simple dinner, soup from a can, crackers on a plate, and ate without tasting. I wondered if Emily ate alone, in some high-rise overlooking the city, or if she surrounded herself with people who cared only for what she could provide. The thought made me ache in places I hadn't known were still alive. Before bed, I walked out onto the porch, the night air sharp against my face. I looked up at the sky, remembering the nights I'd stood out here with Linda, her hand tucked into mine as we watched Emily chase fireflies across the yard. I asked myself if I could forgive, if I could ever let go of the anger that had hardened around my heart. But forgiveness is a tricky thing. It asks for trust, and trust is a currency I wasn't sure I had left. I promised myself that if Emily truly wanted to reconnect, I'd give her a chance. But I also promised that I wouldn't let her hurt me again. Not for love, not for money, not for anything. I lay in bed long after midnight, the darkness pressing in, the weight of the coming days heavy on my chest. I wondered what she would say when I arrived in New York, whether she would look me in the eyes or glance past me at the shadow of the man she'd left behind. The pain was sharp, but it was laced with something new. Curiosity, maybe, or the stubborn flicker of hope that hadn't quite died. If there was a lesson in all this, it was that time heals nothing unless you let it. The past is always waiting, just beneath the surface, ready to drag you under if you let go for even a second. I knew that when I saw Emily again, every old wound would split open. But I also knew I had to try, if only to prove to myself that I was still capable of love, that the man I used to be hadn't vanished entirely. As sleep finally pulled me under, I dreamed of Emily as a child, running through a field of sunflowers, calling for me to catch up. I chased her through the tall grass, breathless with laughter and fear, always just out of reach. When I woke, the memory lingered, bittersweet, unfinished, but enough to remind me why I still cared, why I was willing to risk everything for one last chance at forgiveness. In the days that followed, I felt myself becoming someone else, a man suspended between hope and caution, one foot in the past, one in the foggy unknown of the future. The ordinary routines of my life took on a strange kind of unreality. I would stand in the doorway of Emily's old bedroom, feeling the ache of nostalgia, then catch myself sharpening into something harder. Each hour brought me closer to New York, and the closer I got, the more the puzzle of my daughter's sudden return gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the memory of her voice, the precise way she timed her apology and her invitation, the way she'd slipped the news story about my lottery win into the conversation like a surgeon sliding in a scalpel. It wasn't just the words, it was what they left unsaid. If I was being honest with myself, what scared me most was how much I wanted to believe she meant every word, that somewhere beneath her armor of ambition and silence, the little girl who once called me her hero was still alive. But the signs didn't fit. It was as if I was staring at a photograph in which someone had carefully painted out all the shadows, leaving only what they wanted me to see. Restlessness drove me into action. That Friday, I decided to call her. I told myself it was just to confirm the travel plans, but the truth ran deeper. As the phone rang, My hand trembled and I forced myself to keep my tone steady. When Emily picked up, her voice was as bright and practiced as before. I asked her about the party, what time, who'd be there, what she wanted for her birthday. Her answers slid around my questions, smooth and polished. I caught myself listening not just for what she said, but for what she didn't say, searching for some signal I'd missed the first time. Then, almost without thinking, I told her something that wasn't true. I said there'd been a mistake with the lottery ticket, that the money had turned out to be less than everyone thought, barely enough to pay off my debts. There was a pause just long enough to catch a change in the air. I heard her inhale, a soft, sharp sound, and then the warm coat of her voice slipped a little. She said she was sorry, of course, and made a few sympathetic noises. But suddenly the conversation was shorter, colder, the light in it fading as if someone had switched off a lamp. After we hung up, I felt hollow, but not surprised. The moment lingered, sharp as the snap of a branch on a cold morning. It was as if I'd set a trap and she'd walked right into it. Her concern evaporated the instant the prospect of easy money disappeared. My hope, thin and tattered, began to fall away. In its place came something colder, a kind of resolution that I hadn't felt in years. That night, I sat at my old kitchen table, the surface cluttered with receipts, scratch pads, and the yellowed remnants of life before everything changed. I started to write down every detail I could remember about Emily's recent calls and the stories I'd found online. It was a habit born of too many years fixing cars, diagnosing what was wrong not just by sound but by sequence, listening for what didn't belong, tracking the little things until they revealed the big problem. I wrote down the names of companies mentioned in those news clippings, the lawsuits filed by investors, the shadow of something rotten lurking behind Emily's polished public persona. When the sun rose, I was still at the table, paper scattered everywhere. I realized with a start that I was doing what Emily never thought I could. Putting the pieces together not as a desperate father, but as a man determined not to be fooled again. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of pride. Saturday afternoon, I drove out to the next town over and sat in the corner booth of a greasy diner. Old habits surfacing as I sipped weak coffee and watched strangers come and go. It felt like the world was full of secrets, and all of them were floating just beyond my grasp. I wondered how many of these people lived with wounds they never talked about, regrets they carried like stones in their pockets. I made a few phone calls, pretending to be interested in investment opportunities, asking careful questions about Emily's reputation in the business world. The answers came back in a rush of uncomfortable laughter, caution, and even a few veiled warnings. My daughter, it seemed, was known for making big promises and disappearing when things fell apart. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay awake thinking about Linda, wishing I could ask her what to do. She'd always had a way of seeing through people, cutting to the truth with a glance. I could almost hear her saying, "Don't confuse love with blindness, Walt. Sometimes, letting go is the only way to hold on." I tried to picture the last conversation I'd had with Emily before she left, to remember if there'd been anything I could have done differently. But memory is a tricky thing. It rewrites itself with every retelling, blurring the lines between guilt and fact until you can't tell which is which. On Sunday morning, I went to church for the first time in years. I sat in a back pew, surrounded by families with children, the kind of ordinary happiness that used to make me envious. I didn't pray for forgiveness, I didn't think I deserved it. Instead, I asked for clarity, for the strength to see Emily as she really was, not as I wanted her to be. After the service, I sat in my truck for a long time, letting the engine idle while I stared at the dashboard. I realized I wasn't angry, not really. What I felt was a deep, aching sense of responsibility, a need to make peace with the mistakes I'd made, to give Emily one last chance to be honest, even if it broke my heart all over again. The week passed in a blur of preparation. I packed my suitcase, double-checked bus schedules, and made a list of questions I needed answered. I called Emily once more, this time to tell her I was coming, but also to ask about her business. She danced around the subject, evasive, almost defensive. She said everything was fine, but the tremor in her voice told another story. I hung up, convinced that there was something she wasn't telling me, something that would change everything if I only knew where to look. The day before I left, I got a letter in the mail. A formal-looking envelope, heavy paper, no return address. Inside was an invitation to Emily's birthday party, embossed in silver, her new last name written in elegant script. It was the kind of thing you'd expect from someone with something to prove. I traced the lettering with my finger, remembering the girl who used to make birthday cards out of construction paper and glue, messy with love. I set the invitation on the mantel beside the photo of Linda, the one taken at the county fair years ago. I promised myself I'd go, but I wouldn't go blind. The morning I left for New York, the air was thick with the promise of rain. I loaded my suitcase into the back of a friend's pickup and rode in silence to the station. The landscape blurred past the windows, fields giving way to towns. The slow crawl of time marked only by the ticking of my watch. I watched the sun rise behind clouds, each mile carrying me further from the man I'd been, closer to the truth I couldn't avoid. On the train, I kept thinking about the look in Emily's eyes the last time I saw her. Was it anger, or something more complicated? Was it a warning, or a plea for understanding I'd missed? Each possibility cut in a different direction, and I found myself rehearsing the conversation I hoped we'd have, words tumbling over each other in my mind. By the time I reached Manhattan, the city was pulsing with life. The scale of everything was overwhelming. The buildings pressing in from all sides, the crowd indifferent and relentless. I checked into a small hotel off Canal Street, the kind of place that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpets. I dropped my bag on the bed and stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror, searching for signs of the father I'd once been. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Emily, cheerful and bright, asking if I'd made it okay, reminding me of the time and address for her party. I typed a brief reply, careful not to say too much. The truth was, I didn't know what I would find. Maybe a daughter who regretted the past. Maybe a stranger who'd built walls too high for me to climb. As I lay awake in that narrow bed, I tried to imagine how the story would end. Part of me wanted to believe in redemption, in the kind of forgiveness that rewrites the past. But another part, sharper and wiser, braced for disappointment. I promised myself that whatever happened, I would not let hope become a weakness, would not let love blind me to what was right in front of me. Sleep finally came, slow and uneasy. In my dreams, I saw Linda again, her face soft and kind, her voice reminding me that the hardest lessons are the ones that matter most. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, ready for the reckoning I knew was coming. New York in April was nothing like Ohio, and the difference went deeper than the skyline or the rush of cars and voices pouring through the city streets. For years I'd pictured myself invisible here, just a shadow among millions. But when I stepped out of that taxi on a cool, clear Friday night, my heart was hammering, every nerve lit up with anticipation and something close to dread. My suitcase bumped along behind me as I walked beneath the glow of brownstone stoops and blinking neon. I felt exposed, not just to the city but to my own doubts and memories, all the old hurts swirling with the danger of hope. The day of Emily's birthday party arrived too quickly. The hotel room I rented in Brooklyn was small, the mattress too firm, the air scented with a mix of cleaning powder and something floral I could never place. I stood by the window, looking out at the city's patchwork of rooftops and water towers. There was a tension in my chest, a constant ache that sharpened with every passing hour. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to see my daughter again, to step into her world after so many years as nothing but a memory. In my mind, I rehearsed the questions I wanted to ask, but none of them sounded right once I spoke them out loud. I spent the morning walking aimlessly, winding through blocks of old Italian bakeries and newly built glass condos. The city was alive in a way I had never been. Everywhere, people moving with purpose, with stories I'd never know. I sat for a while in a tiny park, pigeons picking at the sidewalk near my feet. I remembered Emily as a child, chasing after birds in the square back home, her laughter ringing in the open air. That memory collided with the woman she'd become, the one who now sent out invitations stamped in silver, who knew how to charm a roomful of strangers but could not seem to look her own father in the eyes. Back in the hotel, I changed into the best suit I owned. one that Linda had insisted I keep even after we sold nearly everything else to pay for her treatments. The fabric felt stiff, unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. My hands shook as I tied my tie, so much so that I had to start over twice. Each attempt was a reminder of time's relentless march. The last time I'd worn this suit was at Linda's funeral, and the memory of that day flickered through me now, a bitter wind that threatened to sweep me off my feet. Before leaving, I reached for the small, square box I'd wrapped the night before. Inside was not money or jewels, but a photograph, one taken the summer before everything fell apart. Emily, sunburned and grinning, holding up a first-place ribbon at the county fair, Linda's arms slung around her shoulders. I wanted to give her something real, something to remind her who she'd been before the world got so complicated. As I tucked the box into my jacket pocket, I wondered if she'd see it as a peace offering or just another reminder of everything we'd lost. The brownstone where Emily lived was grand in the way that only New York homes can be. Tall windows, elegant steps, a doorman whose polite smile never reached his eyes. As I stepped inside, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses floated down the hallway, a cocktail of voices layered over piano music and the low hum of expensive conversation. The air was thick with perfume, ambition, and something I couldn't quite name. Perhaps desperation, perhaps just the anticipation of a party where everyone hoped to be seen, to belong, to impress. Emily greeted me at the door, her embrace practiced and light. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, a hint of calculation behind the warmth. She looked radiant, dressed in a deep blue gown that caught the light and drew the eyes of everyone around her. I wanted to believe the smile was real, that she was glad I had come, but old instincts made me wary. There were too many layers, too much left unsaid in the way she guided me into the crowded room, introducing me as her father, the lucky winner from Ohio. The guests were a tapestry of New York's glittering hopefuls, investors, entrepreneurs, friends who looked at me with polite curiosity, sizing me up as if I were a new acquisition rather than a father returned from exile. Emily flitted among them with ease, laughter bright but her eyes flicking back to me, watching for my reaction, for any sign of discomfort. I let myself be ushered to the drinks table, listened to a man in a designer suit talk about market fluctuations as if he expected me to join in with tales of sudden wealth. I nodded where it seemed polite, but my mind was far away, measuring every word and gesture. It wasn't hard to see the cracks beneath the surface. The apartment was beautiful, but the corners showed signs of wear. Bills stacked by the sink, unopened letters tucked beneath magazines. A tension in Emily's movements that spoke of things slipping out of control. More than once, I saw her excuse herself from a conversation to check her phone, her expression flickering between hope and frustration. I noticed a group of her friends clustered near the kitchen, their conversation shifting to whispers as I passed. There was something hungry in their smiles, a sense that everyone here was playing a game, and no one wanted to be the one left without a seat when the music stopped. As the night deepened, I found myself alone for a moment, standing near the window. The city stretched out before me, a mosaic of lights and shadow. I felt the weight of the photograph in my pocket, the silent ache of years wasted and love left unsaid. I turned to see Emily approaching, her face bright with the effort of being a gracious host. She pulled me aside, lowered her voice, and spoke of opportunities, of dreams that just needed a little more funding to come true. She painted pictures of a future where she could finally prove herself, not just to the world, but to me. I listened, heart sinking with each carefully chosen word. She never once asked about Ohio, about Linda, about the life we'd shared. Every sentence was a pitch, every smile a negotiation. I recognized the look in her eyes, the same one I'd seen in men who'd come to the garage desperate for credit, for one more chance to outrun their mistakes. A plan formed in my mind, slow and steady, as I watched her move through the crowd, laughter too loud, movements too quick. I had seen enough to know she was in trouble, that whatever fortune she'd built in the city was crumbling beneath her feet. I thought of the news clippings I'd found, the angry words of investors who'd lost everything, the lawsuits piling up in her wake. She was balancing on the edge of something dangerous, and whether she realized it or not, She was pulling me toward the abyss with her. Instead of running from the truth, I decided to face it head-on. That night, back in my hotel room, I pulled out the stack of papers I'd gathered and reread each one. I made a list of names, people who had reached out online, stories half-whispered in angry comments and buried news reports. I wrote careful emails to a handful of them, not as a vengeful father, but as someone who believed in consequences, in the kind of justice that doesn't wait for courts to catch up. I told them where Emily would be, when and how to find her, what questions to ask. I attached copies of the evidence, the emails and bank statements that painted a picture too clear to ignore. I didn't ask them to forgive or forget, only to see the truth for themselves. It was a strange feeling, being both protector and judge, a father who loved and a man who refused to be fooled again. The next morning, the city was gray and wet. I wandered the streets, buying coffee from a cart and watching as commuters rushed past, umbrellas snapping open like black wings. I felt invisible again, but not powerless. Each step brought me closer to the moment I'd chosen, the moment when I would hand Emily the gift she'd been running from all these years. That evening, I dressed once more in the stiff suit, the photograph box heavy in my pocket. I rode the elevator up to Emily's apartment with a sense of inevitability, as if every decision I'd ever made had led me to this night. The guests were already gathering, their voices swelling with excitement and anticipation. Emily greeted me at the door, her smile as bright and brittle as glass. As the party swelled, the tension grew. I watched her laugh with friends, make toasts, drop hints about business deals that shimmered just out of reach. Each time she looked my way, I felt the distance between us grow wider. It was nearly time. I felt my resolve harden, the last traces of doubt burning away. Tonight, I would not let hope blind me. Tonight, I would be the man Linda always believed I could be. A man who faced the truth no matter how much it hurt. The city lights glittered beyond the windows, and I knew that somewhere out there, the people I'd contacted were making their way to the address I'd given them. I waited, breath held, as the night edged toward its reckoning. Emily's world was about to tilt, and I was the quiet force standing at its edge, ready to show her the cost of running from the truth. It was the kind of night when the city's sharpness seemed to glow through the glass, every light outside competing with the candles and laughter swirling inside Emily's apartment. The party had reached its high tide. Guests hovered near the bar, trading business cards and inside jokes, while a jazz trio played notes that melted into the din of conversation. Emily moved among her friends like a woman orchestrating her own myth, pausing to squeeze a shoulder, raise a glass, laugh with a perfectly measured lilt. She had a way of commanding attention, a skill she'd learned as a child, but tonight there was an edge in her voice, a tremor behind the practiced charm. I saw her glance my way, the briefest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It was the first time all night she looked less like a socialite and more like the daughter I used to know. I kept mostly to the background, as if my stillness could make me invisible. But I watched everything. The nervous tapping of her heels when she thought no one was looking, the way she double-checked her phone every few minutes. People made small talk with me about Ohio, the lottery, the miracle of late-life fortune. I answered politely, hiding the storm of memory and suspicion churning inside me. I caught bits of conversation, her friends speculating about her next business move, someone whispering about an investor who'd backed out last week. Every now and then, I caught my own name, spoken with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. The hour crept on, and with each minute, the atmosphere thickened, an unspoken tension weaving itself through the party like a thread pulled too tight. Emily's confidence seemed to falter under the surface, replaced by a kind of restless desperation. When she pulled me aside, her voice had a brittle edge as she thanked me for coming, told me how much it meant to her. I saw in her eyes a plea I could barely recognize. Was it love, or fear, or just the hope that I'd be her savior one more time? I reached into my pocket and wrapped my hand around the box I'd brought, feeling the ridges of the old photograph inside. She noticed my hesitation. The air around us crackled with expectation, as if everyone sensed that the night was poised for some revelation. Suddenly the doorbell rang, a sharp, unexpected sound that sliced through the music and conversation. Emily stiffened. The guests turned, attention shifting like a flock of birds startled by a gunshot. I watched her composure slip, if only for a moment, her shoulders tensing, her hand gripping her glass so tightly I thought it might break. She moved to answer the door, pausing to smooth her dress and summon a smile. I could see her rehearsing it in her mind, ready to greet another latecomer or perhaps another potential investor. But when the door swung open, the mood in the room turned. 3 people entered. One in a dark suit, another with a stack of folders, a third whose eyes swept the room like a hawk. The chatter died to a hush, the only sound now the faint clinking of glasses and the shuffling of feet as guests turned to see who these strangers were. The man in the suit stepped forward, introduced himself in a quiet, measured tone. He held out a letter, his eyes fixed on Emily. There was something unmistakable in his posture, a sense of old anger, tightly contained. The woman beside him placed a thick envelope on the table, sliding it toward Emily with a motion that brooked no argument. The third guest, taller than the others, didn't speak but radiated a steady, simmering fury. Emily looked from one face to the next, her own mask cracking, confusion and alarm bleeding through. The newcomers addressed her with the authority of people who had come not to celebrate, but to collect. The words that followed were soft, but devastating. They spoke of broken promises, unpaid debts, investments lost and trust betrayed. They named companies and dates and figures, reciting a list of grievances with the precision of a surgeon exposing a wound. The papers in their hands were legal complaints, records of lawsuits, proof of money gone missing. The woman's voice was firm, relentless, each statement another nail in the coffin of Emily's carefully constructed image. All around, the party froze. Guests drew back, unsure where to look. Some pulled out their phones, others glanced at Emily, their admiration souring into discomfort and doubt. The jazz trio faltered, the melody stumbling into silence. I stood apart, feeling both the sting of pity and the satisfaction of justice. My daughter's world, built on stories and second chances, was crumbling in real time. I remembered the little girl who'd once wept over a lost science project, the teenager who'd slammed her bedroom door and called me heartless. Now, confronted with the consequences of choices she'd made, she looked not angry but lost, her confidence draining away, replaced by a desperate, hunted look. One of the guests, an older woman in pearls, whispered something sharp about fraud. Another man, who'd spent most of the night bragging about his own successes, quietly excused himself, clutching his jacket and avoiding everyone's eyes. The silence deepened, broken only by the clicking of heels as more people slipped out, their hunger for association replaced by self-preservation. Emily's voice was thin, pleading, as she tried to explain, to deflect, to accuse. She looked around the room for support but found only stares and downcast glances. The man with the envelope laid out the evidence, emails, contracts, wire transfers, all pointing in one direction. The party had become a trial, and there was no jury left but the cold, indifferent faces of her former admirers. She turned to me then, eyes wide, voice trembling with a pain I hadn't heard in years. For a moment, I almost stepped forward, almost reached out to shield her from the world she'd deceived. But I held back. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment I had prepared for, not out of vengeance, but because I loved her too much to let her continue down this path. I stepped into the light, the photograph box still in my hand. She reached for me, desperate, but I didn't move. I met her gaze, letting her see every ounce of sorrow, regret, and unspoken hope that I carried. I said the words I had rehearsed in the quiet loneliness of my hotel room, words that tasted like salt and ash. I told her that love meant more than forgiveness, that real love sometimes required the courage to let someone face the consequences of their actions. She shook her head, anger flaring, her voice rising in a final attempt to command the room, to rewrite the story in her favor. But no one was listening. The spell was broken. The man in the suit told her the authorities had already been notified, that the evidence would be presented in court, that the reckoning she tried to avoid was now unavoidable. I watched her crumble, watched the truth land with the force of a lifetime's worth of broken promises. I felt the weight of years spent hoping, waiting, believing that one day she would come home. Instead, I saw her brought low not by anyone else's hand, but by her own choices. As the last guests drifted out, I left the photograph box on the table, a reminder of what she'd lost, what we both had lost. I didn't look back. The city outside was alive and indifferent, neon lights flickering in puddles, sirens wailing in the distance. I walked into the night with the strange clarity that comes when the worst has already happened, and all that's left is the truth. It struck me as I turned the corner that justice, when it comes, is rarely triumphant. There was no applause, no satisfaction, only a hollow relief that the lies were finally over. I thought of Linda and what she would say. I thought of Emily, alone in her apartment, stripped of every pretense. And I wondered if, beneath all the anger and betrayal, there might still be a path back, someday, to the girl she used to be. The walk back to the hotel was a slow, deliberate surrender to the city's indifferent pulse. The laughter and music from Emily's party faded behind me, replaced by the rhythmic hush of traffic and the distant echo of sirens. I felt as though I was moving through the world in the same way I had for years, half here, half somewhere else. My mind spun with memories that wouldn't settle, questions that would never quite be answered, and the ache of a love that had never stopped, no matter how many times it was bruised. Back in my room, I took off my suit, folding it carefully, every motion a ritual to keep my hands steady. I stared at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, seeing both the father I had tried to be and the man who had just delivered his own daughter to the judgment she had spent her whole life running from. I told myself it had been the right thing, the only thing, but the hollow weight in my chest argued otherwise. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let the city noise drift up to the window, a reminder that the world moved on whether you wanted it to or not. Sleep was a stranger that night. I drifted in and out, haunted by dreams of Emily as a child, her hand tucked into mine, her eyes shining with a trust one could barely remember. In those dreams, I was back in Ohio, back before the losses, before the silence. I woke before dawn, startled by a vision of Linda's face. Steady, kind. Her forgiveness of presence I could feel even now. The city was still dark when I packed my bag, checked out of the hotel, and hailed a cab toward Penn Station. I didn't look back at Emily's building. I didn't trust myself to bear it. On the train ride west, I watched the scenery blur by, the city giving way to endless fields and towns that looked so much like home it almost hurt. The weight of everything settled in my bones, heavy and unyielding. I wondered if Emily was alone, whether she'd found comfort in any of the friends who'd stayed, or if the night had left her with nothing but regret and the cold company of her own mistakes. I wished I could believe she would find her way back. Not to me, perhaps, but to some truer version of herself. By the time I arrived in Ohio, the sun was shining. The air was crisp, the sky impossibly wide and blue. I walked the few blocks to my house, feeling the comfort of familiar cracks in the sidewalk, the faded paint of neighbors' porches. I let myself in, the old hinges sighing in welcome, and set my bag down by the door. I stood in the center of the living room, turning slowly, reacquainting myself with the shape of solitude. I knew what I had to do. I took the photograph from my jacket, the one I had meant to give Emily, and placed it on the mantel beside Linda's picture. The two of them, mother and daughter, smiling out at me from years when hope had seemed endless. I let the ache of it wash over me, a sharpness that was both punishment and release. In the days that followed, I moved through the motions of life, but everything felt changed. I drove to the store, greeted old friends, tinkered with the pickup truck that had outlasted almost everything else. Word of what had happened in New York drifted back slowly. News stories about the party, the charges, the investors coming forward with their stories. There was no sense of triumph in any of it. The victory tasted of ashes, a reminder that justice, while necessary, was never clean. One morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank checkbook and the lottery winnings still untouched in my account. I thought of all the ways money had fractured my family, how it had twisted hope into suspicion and love into leverage. I decided then that the only way forward was to give it meaning. I drove to the community center where Linda had volunteered, the place she'd poured her heart into even when we had nothing to spare. The director remembered her well, tears shining in her eyes as I explained my plan. Together, we set up a fund in Linda's name, one that would help families in crisis. Rent, medicine, groceries, a hand up instead of a handout. It was a small thing in the face of everything lost, but as the weeks passed, it grew. Families who had been strangers came to thank me, their faces tired but grateful, their stories echoing my own in ways that made forgiveness possible, if not easy. I found myself teaching again. Basic car repairs to teenagers who'd never held a wrench, computer classes for single moms looking for work. Each act of kindness was a step back toward something I thought I'd lost forever. Emily's absence was a shadow that never quite left. Some days the silence felt heavier than others. I wrote her a letter I never sent, telling her that I loved her, that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, that sometimes justice and mercy were just different sides of the same hard truth. I told her about the fund, about the families it was helping, about the way her mother's memory was living on in the lives of people who needed it most. As spring deepened, the community center flourished. I saw the change not just in the building but in myself. The old bitterness faded, replaced by something quieter. A kind of peace born from doing what I could, where I was with what I had left. I still missed Linda every day. I missed Emily too, though I'd learned that missing someone was not the same as needing them to come back. The town noticed. People stopped me in the grocery store, at the gas station, even in church, to say they'd heard what I'd done, that they were proud, that Linda would be proud too. I shrugged it off, embarrassed by the attention, but inside I felt something settle. A sense that, for the first time in a long time, I was moving forward, not just surviving. One evening, as I was locking up the community center, my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was unmistakable. It was one of the investors from Emily's party, calling to thank me, not just for the tip-off, but for the example I'd set. He told me that some of the money had been recovered, that Emily was facing the consequences of her choices, but that it wasn't about revenge. It was about making things right, about giving people a chance to rebuild. After the call, I sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the maples, the same way Linda and I used to do. I thought about the future, about whether Emily would ever forgive me, whether I could ever truly forgive her. The truth was, I didn't know. Some wounds heal slow, if at all. But as the sky darkened and the fireflies came out, I felt a hope that was different than before. Not the desperate hope that things would return to how they were, but the quiet certainty that even broken things could be put to use, that a life could be made meaningful again, piece by piece. In time, word came from New York. Emily had pleaded guilty. The sentence was lighter than many expected: probation, restitution, mandatory counseling. I imagined her standing in front of a judge, her voice shaking but proud, taking responsibility at last. There was a bitter pride in that, an acknowledgement that she had found the bottom and decided to climb back up. I wondered if she would call, if she would ever set foot in Ohio again. I wondered if, someday, we would sit at the same kitchen table, talk about the years lost, and find something new to build on. For now, I accepted what I had. A legacy of hard lessons, the memory of love that did not fade, and a place in the world where my hands could still make a difference. I thought of Linda's favorite saying, scrawled on the wall of the community center: do the next right thing. That was all I could do. As the last light slipped away, I closed my eyes and breathed in the peace of the evening. I didn't know if Emily would ever forgive me, or if I could ever forgive myself. But I knew this much: justice had come in its way. Mercy had followed, unexpected and quiet. And somewhere in the space between those two, I had found myself again.